Alrighty. So I'm going to continue the discussion about social cost of carbon. And one thing I notice is that right now everybody's an expert on carbon taxes and the social cost of carbon. This is James Baker, part of a group of elder statesmen who made a presentation, issued a report, confidently pronouncing on some policy options. The trouble is, maybe next time they'll issue a report on quantum theory or something like that. This is a very technical topic, and there are a lot of people that weigh in on it. Even some of my colleagues in economics jump in on carbon taxes, and it's obviously haven't spent the time to read up on it. So there are a lot of wrong ideas that are floating out there, and I'm going to try to clean up a few of them today. To summarize what I'm going to say, the main thing is the social cost of carbon on its own is never the right number to use in policy decisions. So if someone says the social cost of carbon is $30, therefore we should do X, Y, and Z, there are some important steps that they're missing along the way. Now, bear in mind that all that number does, all the social cost of carbon, it's meant just to tally up the numbers on one side of the ledger. We are ignoring all the benefits of fossil fuel use. That also has to be brought into the whole discussion, obviously. So it's only half of a benefit cost analysis. So it isn't a legitimate criticism of the social cost of carbon to say that fossil fuel use is beneficial. It would be legitimate if that was ignored in the policy discussion, but the social cost of carbon concept itself is only part of the picture. As Kevin pointed out, some of the models ignore the potential benefits of CO2 fertilization and warming trends, countries like Canada that would actually benefit from longer growing seasons. Some of the models just assume that all out, and that's not a legitimate modeling strategy. And a positive social cost of carbon certainly doesn't imply that fossil fuel use should be eliminated. So on that point, suppose magically we come up with a number, $31.24 per ton. That's the social cost of carbon. All that tells us is that the use of fossil fuels by someone to run their car or something imposes an external cost on the rest of the world. If we charge people that cost or something like that cost, chances are they're just going to continue using the fuels as they were before because the use of the fuels is very valuable. The more important thing is that if there's a regulation that costs more than $31.24 per ton, we shouldn't implement that regulation. It's kind of a cutoff level that says everything that costs more than this is more costly to society than the benefit that it would do. And this gets forgotten in a lot of the popular discussion. So when we talk about carbon taxes, for instance, economists like to think of it as an either-or proposition. Carbon taxes would replace all the regulations, not be added on top of them. And as I'll show you, that's important because a lot of the regulations in place cost way more than even the IWG's estimate of the social cost of carbon. So what I'll get to next is that we wouldn't actually want to charge a carbon tax of $31.24 per ton. It needs to be modified from there. That strategy only applies in a very simple textbook world where there are none of the real world complications in our economy. So let me draw a picture at this point. On the horizontal axis there's emissions, and on the vertical axis there's money, dollars per ton or dollars per unit of emissions. And there's a downward sloping line that in economics we call the marginal abatement cost curve. It's like a demand curve. If you had to pay $10 a ton for your emissions, how much would you emit? Well, it's just like if you had to pay $10 for shirts, how many shirts would you buy? It's just a demand curve. So at the beginning of the process, there's no price being charged on emissions, so everybody just goes to the part that corresponds to a price of 0, where the curve meets the horizontal axis, and that's called the unregulated emissions level. And then when we think about something like a carbon tax or an emissions tax, the idea is, okay, now we're going to raise the price of the emitting activity on the expectation that in response to that higher price, people will reduce their emissions. So we would go to that point on the graph there. And if we're happy with the price that's being charged, then that means we have to be happy with the emission level that results from it. So this is the basic textbook model, and then now the combination of the price and the quantity means all of a sudden there's revenue that has to be disposed of somehow, and that gets people kind of excited because it sounds like free money all of a sudden. The policy is generating lots of money and we can spend it, but how that money is used is extremely important for determining the cost of the policy for reasons that I won't get into today in detail. But let's suppose we knew the social cost of carbon and we set that as the price. So this is the simple textbook model a lot of economists have in mind. If we know that number, T star, then that means we would go to emissions level E star and we're done. We're happy, that's the right outcome. I would caution that a lot of people who advocate for carbon taxes don't actually like the implied emissions level that goes with it. They have in mind a reasonable low carbon tax, but they want emissions to go way down even further. So if you sort of keep reading in their reports that, well, the tax on its own won't be enough, we'll have to add in lots of regulations, and then they're violating their own logic. But we get this in Canada a lot. I don't know if it happens down here. Now, there's a complication, which is that first line I drew is the private marginal abatement cost. That means it's the abatement costs for individuals and emitters. There's another category of costs, though, associated with how this new policy interacts with the rest of the tax system, these tax interaction costs. And so there's a social marginal abatement cost curve. And there was a lot of writing on this back in the 80s and 90s, and the effect is it looks like a rotation of the curve up like that. So the optimum is actually no longer at E star, where I drew. It's out there. So what we want is a policy to get us to the higher emissions level. And in order to do that, we would need a lower tax. So that second tax rate is lower because people respond according to their private marginal abatement cost, but we want an outcome on the social marginal abatement cost curve. So what's the formula for reducing that tax rate? Well, it turns out it's a fairly simple formula. You would take the social cost of carbon and divide it by a number called the marginal cost of public funds. Now, MCPF is an old term from public finance. If you're in government, you want to raise $1 for the government revenue. It doesn't cost $1 to the economy. In order to raise that revenue, you would have to destroy more than $1's worth of private economic wealth and welfare. Like you might have to destroy $1.50 worth of private economic activity to raise another $1 of revenue for the government. So the marginal cost of public funds is more than $1. And it can be quite high. And an important point here, sort of an extra nuance to this, is even if everybody's going to pay the same social cost of carbon, it doesn't mean that every country should have the same tax rate, because every country has different marginal cost of public funds. In Ontario, for instance, a recent estimate is our marginal cost of public funds is now over $6. We have very high taxes in Ontario, and the tax mix is particularly distortionary. Alberta's down around $1.70. It's on the lower end, but Ontario, it's over $6. So if the social cost of carbon is $42, then that would mean the tax rate should only be $7 in Ontario, much higher in Alberta. So that's one adjustment that we make just to take account of the distortions of the tax system. But I'm still assuming a whole bunch of stuff here. One is that we don't have any command and control policies remaining in the background, and or we're not using tradable quotas or cap and trade in the background. Also, I'm assuming the rest of the tax system is optimal. It's fully efficient, which is never the case. And also, I'm assuming that the money that's raised through a carbon tax is used to reduce other tax rates. If you follow James Baker and his group's advice and just send out checks to everybody and pay them as dividends, that actually makes the whole thing much more distortionary. So what happens if we add these assumptions in? Well, the picture changes again. So the curve, the social marginal abatement cost curve, it isn't a rotation, it shifts out like so. And so now we're not at the right outcome again even with our lower tax rate. So I'm going to clean up the diagram here, and now if you look at that unregulated emissions level, the odd thing is that the social marginal abatement cost curve, now you have to jump to get up to it. The first unit isn't free anymore, so there's a threshold that you have to cross for the first unit of emissions reduction. And now we want to get to the crossing point between the social cost of carbon and the social marginal abatement cost curve, which is out there. So now we can see, and the way I've drawn the diagram here, we're at a pretty low tax rate once we take into account that threshold jump. In this case, you get to a point that's so low that a carbon tax is very close to doing nothing at all. The optimal emissions level is now pretty close to the unregulated emissions level. This is the outcome if you have a suboptimal tax system, if the carbon tax is not your sole regulatory instrument, and if the policy is not revenue raising or revenue neutral. In other words, if you're doing this in the real world, if you're outside the textbook world. Okay, now how big is that threshold value? I can only find one reasonably thorough estimate of it in the literature. It was back in 1996. It came out at about $50 a ton for the US economy. So it's actually a pretty big number. In today's dollars, that'll be about $75 a ton. So if you ignore all the complaints, I shouldn't call them complaints, all the criticisms of the IWG work that you've heard so far, and we'll just take their number of about $40 a ton at face value, it's still below this threshold. So the first unit of emission reduction in this approach is still welfare reducing, even if carbon is a positive externality. That's the picture that we have. The social cost of carbon, just on the mainstream of what we've seen so far, is apparently below the damage threshold, and policies can't be reduced. Now, what Kevin showed you was this contrast between that green curve, the Rowe-Baker equilibrium climate sensitivity distribution, and the empirical literature. And in our work, we drew on the second one from the right there, the Lewis and Curry distribution. Obviously, the empirical literature is not drawing from the modeling distribution for climate sensitivity. When you put that into the model, then of course the social cost of carbon drops even further. But even if we ignored that, my colleagues and I have done work in recent years pricing out some of the existing policies in Canada on a per ton basis, and you can see like vehicle efficiency standards over $300 a ton, home energy efficiency standards going up to the Alberta oil sands cap is going to cost them over $1,000 a ton to implement, and the biofuels mandate is coming in at over $3,000 a ton. So again, all these regulations are costing way too much at the margin. All right. So to conclude, what would I do if I could write the whole policy down? First of all, for the reasons I just stated, we need to clear the decks, remove all the current policies, and I would prefer a pricing instrument to a regulatory approach. I differ from the IM approach. See, the IM will give you this nice, elegant policy ramp where the tax goes up and over time, but it does that by assuming away everything that makes this a complicated and uncertain issue. I've worked out an alternative approach where you start with a very low tax rate, but it's indexed to observed temperature. And it's possible to show theoretically why that would track the unobservable optimal tax rate. But intuitively, what that means is if we're not going to have much global warming, the tax rate's not going to move. And if it is turning out to be a huge problem, then yeah, the tax rate will go up and people have to respond to it. So everybody basically will form an expectation of what the climate's going to do, and they'll get the outcome that they prefer as far as the policy. Then we add to that a futures market. And here what the government would have to commit to doing is auctioning off exemption certificates. A certificate exempts you from paying the tax in some year in the future. So you can buy certificates that exempt you from paying the tax 30 years from now. So then you have to decide, how much am I willing to pay for that certificate? Well, what do I think the temperature is going to be 30 years from now? There would be a market for these certificates, and basically the world's financial markets would become the world's most powerful climate model. So you'd then get this price path for these certificates that would not only tell you what the price of CO2 emissions should be, but it would also be a set of objective forecasts of what the climate is going to do. Now, someone might look at those forecasts, and if it turns out to be some sort of up and down thing like that without much of an upward trend, they might say, oh, that's all wrong. I mean, we know the temperature's going to go way up, and people are ignoring all this terrible warnings of the future. In that case, great. If you've got private information that you think is credible, then go buy these permits, because you're going to make a lot of money off of this. So you don't need to argue about who's right on the science and all that. You just put your money where your mouth is and invest in the market. More formally, I can show, I do this with a colleague, we've shown that this trading process would actually yield objective forecasts of the climate that would use all available information. And as far as I know, it's the only mechanism anyone's proposed that would do this, that would solve all these problems of politicization in the science process. You just look at what the market's telling you, and that's the best information you'd have on what the climate's going to do and what the price of emissions should be. So, Wrapping up, in the real world, the social cost of carbon is never the appropriate rate to use for tax or regulatory analysis. It always has to be adjusted in some important ways. The social cost of carbon needs to exceed a threshold for tax or regulations to yield a net benefit, but this is unlikely given the policies that are proposed, especially when we deal with the empirical climate sensitivity issue. And I would like to see us harness the market to yield a mechanism for unbiased climate forecasting. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.